Welcome to this afternoon's column webinar with Sarah Berthaud of the Galway Mayo Institute of Technology. Delighted to have her here. My name is Daniel Carey. I'm director of the Moore Institute at NUI Galway. The Center for Applied Linguistics and Multilingualism is one of our flagship centers in the Moore Institute, and we're really delighted to support this series, which has covered such remarkable ground and generated a lot of interesting discussion and indeed audiences. We're assisted today by Matthew Garrity. Matthew is our intern in the Moore Institute this year, and delighted to be working with him too. He's handling things behind the scenes. So I'll hand over now to Professor Laura McLaughlin, who is co-director of the center. Laura.
Thank you, Dan, and welcome everybody. It's great to see you all here today this afternoon, and I'm really happy to welcome a colleague I have known for many years, Dr. Sarah Berthaud. Sarah is a lecturer in French at the Galway Mayo Institute of Technology, and she's also a professional French-English translator and interpreter. She completed a PhD on French-English bilingual and multilingual acquisition at NUI Galway with IRC set funding. She then pursued further research in the area as part-time postdoctoral assistant at the French National Center for Scientific Research, or CNRS. And with her multidisciplinary background, Sarah has conducted and continues to conduct research in the areas of bilingualism, second language acquisition, teaching, learning, translation, interpreting, as well as language policy. Her talk today is about bilingual language use and acquisition, motion event French, sequential and simultaneous bilinguals. And she will explore how different descriptions of motion events across cultures can impact language acquisition and use. And she will focus specifically on French, English, adult, sequential, and simultaneous. So just before I hand over to Sarah now, I just would ask you, the participants, questions, please use the Q&A feature rather than the chat. Thank you. So Sarah, over to you now. Forward to yours.
Grazie, Laura. Thank you very much for having me today. It's a real pleasure to be back at NUI Galway, albeit virtually after about 6 or 7 years leaving. So I'm going to start sharing my screen with you folks. I hope. There we go. So you should be able to see my screen now. Can you confirm that's the case?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, thanks.
Thank you so much, folks. So let me start on this. Perfect. So I had a GMIT logo at the bottom of my screen earlier, but given today's announcement that GMIT is now going to merge with IT, Sligo IT and Letterkenny IT, I've removed it because I still don't know what the technological university grouping these 3 institutions is going to be named, so I don't have it just yet. So fresh news today. Before I start, I would like to thank Lara, Dan and John for inviting me to give this talk at CAM, which, as highlighted by Dan, is a flagship in the area in the west of Ireland. I would also like to thank Dr. Stanislav Antonievich, who is named on this presentation, who was my principal supervisor when I did my PhD at NUI Galway. I'd like to thank Professor Jen Conroy, who was secondary supervisor, and also everyone in the departments of speech and language therapy and French within NUI Galway who helped throughout the years. Today's talk is going to focus on motion event, and specifically how we talk about motion event in French and English. So if that's okay with you folks, if you want to participate a little bit, there's a bit of interactive activities at the start. So let me first, yeah, there we go. So here is a picture of taken from the book Frog, Where Are You? Published by Mercer-Meyer in 1969. And what I'd like you to do is take the next minute to send me a sentence in your native language, whatever it is, describing what the owl is doing on the picture. So how is the owl moving? So if you have French, type it in French. If you have English as a native language, type it in Irish. Please do so. I'll give you a minute or so to do that.
Should we use the chat, I wonder, or the Q&A,
Yes.
Laura?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, I would say the chat.
Chat, okay, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. So what is the owl doing? I think we do. Okay, perfect. We already have. Excellent. Thanks, Laura. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, John. So we have, oh, lovely. We have Irish as well from John. Thank you. So,
Sorry, Matthew, it seems that the chat is disabled.
oops, apologies. So,
Sorry, guys, I'll get to that now.
okay, thank you.
That should be working now.
Let's see if we get more. There'll be another 2 to do anyways. Oh, thank you. Hi, Marania. Lovely to see you.
Sorry about that.
No bother at all. I should have told you. Oh, we have Serbian as well, Spanish. Excellent. Hi, Barry. Lovely to see you. Hello, Pilar. Bonjour, Valérie. Okay. Excellent. So what I can show you already from what I've received here is that you will see that the languages are going to differ in how what they're going to describe and how they're going to do so. So if you look at English, the flying is going to be mentioned. So whether it's taking flight, flying down, we have also some sliding here. We have flapping. And typically in English, this is really what is going to happen. You're going to focus on the way a participant moves. Usually in languages that come from Romance languages, so French, Spanish, Italian, the way something moves becomes often optional. So let me see if I can find something. A bit of Spanish. Yeah, here, for instance, with Pilar's from the Spanish, we have the owl goes from the tree flying, blah, blah, blah. So what we will focus on is the path, i.e. where the participant is going. And that's typical of the language. So just to show you what it would look like in English, you'd have something very similar to this, where the owl is flying out of a tree. So your verb is going to describe how the owl is moving, and what you're going to add after your verb, the prepositional phrase, is going to indicate the direction. So you have the fly and out of the tree. So we have what we call a manner verb in the verb and the prepositional phrase with the direction. In French, it tends to be different. We tend to focus in the verb on where the participant is going, and we may, as an option, indicate how this happens. So we talk about, in this case, a path verb, and then we talk about an option adjunct, as in it's not compulsory, and very often, unless it's something that is extremely important to note, it's going to be left out. So it's going to be aller, to go, to leave, to go in. We don't care whether something is walking, limping, unless it's very important. We tend to leave it out. Other Romance languages tend to work that way, even though there are differences. So I'm going to ask you for another bit of work, if that's okay. In here, in this instance, would you be able to describe what this animal is doing? So we have a dog here. So again, if you could put that in and put that into your native language in the chat, it would be brilliant. Yeah, so we have fleeing, huyendo, which is the same, being chased, running, scampering. Yeah, in Irish, we had, yeah, running as well. Okay, we have running here from Warren as well. So yeah, so this is what happens. If something becomes very obvious, you will focus on the manner, or if it becomes important for the context. And that's what I want to highlight here, is that in French, even though we tend to not focus on manner, we do have constructions that allow for this, okay? So it's not just a one-way street. Okay, one more thing, if possible. If you could tell me what this boy is doing. What's he doing? Yeah, Valerie, you had escape there for the bees. Yeah, and again, escape, yeah, indicates the way. So he's looking, climbing into the tree. Yeah, okay, climbing into the tree. Okay, climbing. Yeah, it's lovely. So you can see again with all the different languages involved in the chat, there can be quite a few differences. You can go from just climbing to climbing up a tree, to again using aller for French and se cacher to hide. So it really depends on your language. So your language will allow you to package information in different ways depending on what you want to do. And it's not because there is a certain way that exists in one language that it's going to exist in the other. So we said in French, typically you're going to look at the direction in the verb and maybe indicate how it happens in an adjunct. It's not always the case. You can also encode manner in specific verbs like courir, s'enfuir, to run away. You also have other verbs. Grimper is really to scramble up, to climb up. You also have monter, which monter is a direction. So there are different ways of doing so in French. English, however, has path frame constructions, but tends to be quite systematic in terms of looking at manner. It really likes looking at how people move. So what I'm going to do today is look at how this is used by sequential bilinguals and simultaneous bilinguals when they acquire language. Okay. So I'm going to distinguish bilinguals in two different ways, but in the whole of this study, the bilinguals that took part were people who were using two languages on a daily basis. So not necessarily people who were what we used to call in the literature balanced bilinguals, so people who had a same level-ish of language in the two languages they spoke. Here I'm talking literally about usage, so a bilingual person who is using the two languages every day. And I will have two groups of participants, which I was lucky to recruit. A group of simultaneous bilinguals, in which instances the bilinguals would have been raised with the two languages from birth, and sequential bilinguals who would have acquired one language first and then acquired a second language later. So sequential bilinguals, sometimes there is a bit of overlap with L2 learners if your L2 learners end up being people who use the two languages every day, if that makes sense. One thing to note as well is my simultaneous bilinguals had acquired both languages from birth from their parents, and most of them at the time were living in Ireland, so this might have an influence later on. So research has been done in that area before, and what's been shown is that sequential bilinguals can succeed in acquiring the pattern that's different. So that means that if I have a French native speaker who learns English later on and ends up being an everyday bilingual of English and French, that person may well be able to use the manner construction like I showed you before, like to walk out, to run up, to climb up, etc., and be successful in this, and vice versa. This can be the case if you have English speakers who acquire French later, they are well able to do that. However, this finding is not confirmed for every scenario, and it's also been shown that for French and for English there can be a lot of issues, which you will see later on. The problem is for most of the studies for French and English, what happens is we have studies where we're looking at children bilingual, or bilingual children rather, and they're compared to adult monolinguals. So not necessarily compared children to children, or adults are not compared to other adults. So here, what we're going to be talking about specifically is sequential bilinguals who are adult and simultaneous bilinguals who are adult as well. And that's quite important because that's a difference from what we've done here with other studies that have been published before. When we talk about simultaneous bilinguals, some research has been done between Turkish and German by Daller et al. And their research shows that simultaneous bilinguals, when they're adults, their productions sometimes do not resemble those of monolinguals. So that's why it's important sometimes to remember that a bilingual is definitely not two monolinguals in one, but is a distinct person, and their productions do not resemble those of monolinguals at all times. And so it's important to bear that in mind. What's been showed as well is for our sequential bilinguals is that even when we have sequential bilinguals with very high levels of proficiency in the other language, their sentences are not going to be native-like, which makes sense because that's the same for simultaneous bilinguals as well. When there are issues with the sentences produced to talk about motion, typically it's because the L2 speakers tend to overgeneralize what they've learned. So using the walking out, running out, and all of these in cases where it mightn't be used. And it's also because there is an influence from the other language coming in, a cross-linguistic influence in there. So for this piece of research that I'm going to talk about specifically now is we have based it on three different research questions. The first one is to assess how motion event sentence description is different between sequential and simultaneous bilinguals, French, English, English, French, because remember, I've told you before, this has never been done. Typically, bilinguals are compared to monolinguals, whether they're children or adults. So here we're looking at adult and bilinguals to bilinguals. We're also assessing the level of proficiency. So what we've done is we've recruited sequential bilinguals with different levels of proficiency in the second language that they were using. And we have looked as well at the linguistic training, whether this could have an impact on the acquisition and the use. Because our aims were to see, obviously, the differences between what is produced for sequential and simultaneous bilinguals. We wanted to see if there was incremental learning. So if more proficient bilinguals produced better quality and better quantities of sentences. And if the specialized training here, whether the training in specific translation can impact what they do as well. So I'm going to talk about two very specific experiments. The very first one in which we examined how the animacy of the participant doing the motion can influence the sentence. So whether you have something like a person doing something or a car doing something can have an influence on what is said and described. And the second experiment is about whether if we focus only on manner or only on path, the outcome is going to be better in terms of quantity and quality. So for experiment 1, I'm going to show you results that have been published already in a journal. Experiment 2, it's being written up at present. So a little bit more about the participants. I have to admit, I was very lucky to be able to find all these participants. So I had a group, as you can see here, of simultaneous bilinguals, so people who had learned French and English from birth. Typically, they had one parent speaking one language to them and the other parent speaking the other language to them. The mean age of the participants at the time was 28.99, and I had a fairly balanced group in that, 7 males and 6 females. One thing to note as well is out of these 13 simultaneous bilinguals, 11 of them were living in Ireland at the time of the study, 2 of them were living in France. However, all of them had spent a lot of time in each country, with most participants having spent at least 3 months holidays a year when they were younger, because they were sent to the grandparents or the family, and vice versa for the people who were in France and switched. For my French native speakers with English L2 sequential bilinguals, I had 3 groups recruited. I had a group that matched the B2 level in the CEFR, which for ease of use, I'm going to call upper intermediate here. I had a group that matched the C1, C2 levels, so fairly advanced bilinguals here, and I had a group of translators. So here, the age of onset was calculated as a mean compared to the questionnaire that they filled in when they were recruited. So as you can see, some of the advanced started a little bit earlier than the rest. The mean age was matched roughly in the mid to late 20s, and the gender balance was not as good as with the simultaneous bilinguals, but that's just the way I had it. So for the upper intermediate group, I had 10 participants, advanced at 12, and then I had 9 in the translators. I matched those groups to the reverse order. So English native speakers with French L2, and again, matched them in terms of levels. So B2 level, C1, C2 level, and then translators. And you can see the mean age of L2 onset is similar enough to the one above. The age was a bit different, and the gender distribution was fairly even. Again, I had to work with the people I could recruit, so I was lucky to get so many, really kind of 10, 12, and 9. I managed to match them for number. So what did we do? We worked on a sentence elicitation task, which is when we make pictures describing motion events, and we ask people to describe the pictures. That's pretty much what we do. We build the pictures around sentences, and the sentences are matched for the frequencies of verb and syntactic frames, so that you don't end up with something that's very, very frequent and very, very rare in some other pictures. So it's fairly even. And we also paid attention to manner and obviously path. Okay. The pictures were presented randomly to them, and the participants were instructed to produce 1 sentence to describe the motion event they were seeing, and they had 5 training pictures at the start to get them used to the task, and where they could ask questions if there were any problems. So remember, experiment 1, we are looking at manner and path, but also at animacy in particular. Okay. So for animacy, we have differences between English and French, in that English is a bit looser in that it allows more inanimate things to do things in the language. So you can say something like the son opened the envelope without batting too much of an eyelid, if I may say in English. In French, you really couldn't say that. You would have to say something like the heat of the sun made the envelope open. So you'd have to use the make structure because it kind of implies that there wasn't someone to do it. So it's quite important. And this is in line with the studies that show that for French, animacy is a strong factor in terms of what is looked at. In English, people look at the order of words. In French, we have the subject-verb agreement and then animacy here as well. So the attention paid to animacy varies from language to language, and this is what we've tested in terms of motion event. So just a quick recap. If you have an animate versus inanimate subject, does it influence what you're going to say in the language you're using? So this is a sample of the pictures you might have showed people. So you have a plant climbing up the wall, and you can say that in French, no problem. The plant is climbing up the wall, and then you would have a woman climbing up the wall. So we have the same verb on each side, the same frame on each side. All we're varying is what does the action or the movement. So what we did find out when we ran through all those pictures, so we had 56 pictures in total, 28 for animate, 28 for inanimate. What we found out is that when we ran the statistics, we had a very high effect of animacy. And that means that more correct and expected sentences were produced with animate subjects than inanimate, which we expected, so that was fine. We also had an effect of proficiency for people with English as an L2. So our French native speakers with English L2 sequential bilinguals, the more proficient they were, the better they were at producing grammatically and accurate sentences to describe animates and inanimates. And more important, we had an interaction between animacy and language of production. So our French L1 with English L2 produced more correct and accurate sentences in English L2 than the other sequential bilinguals. And I'll come back to accurate and grammatical when I show you the qualitative analysis, if that makes sense. For our simultaneous bilinguals, what we found was that there was an effect of animacy. So they produced, as you can see, more correct sentences for animate than inanimate in both languages, but there was no language effect at all. So they did the same in both languages. As you can see, the curve is the same, more animates than inanimates, more animates than inanimates. So there was no difference between those two groups here, just between animates and inanimates. The language didn't have an effect. So what we looked at then for results is after doing the statistics, we looked at the qualitative results. And what we noticed is that for sequential bilinguals with English native with French L2, they used quite a few passive structures, okay, with and without animate subjects to describe what was happening. So, for instance, it would say something like "Le gâteau est sorti du four," the cake is going out of the oven, or "Le gâteau est sorti du four par quelqu'un," the cake is going out of the oven by someone, as in the cake is taken out of the oven by someone. So, with the passive structure, you're implying that someone animate is going to be here to do it for you. They also used impersonal animate subjects to describe inanimate scenes. So instead of saying the cake comes out of the oven or the cake is coming out of the oven, let's say one takes out the cake out of the oven. So putting a compulsory animate subjects in when it wasn't necessarily required. And this was similar with our French natives with English L2 sequential bilinguals. They did that as well. They used passive structures and impersonal animate subjects. So cake is taken out of the oven by someone, someone takes the cake out of the oven. But they also had a lot of problems using syntactic frames in English because the prepositions are a big problem for from the English perspective. They tend to be much more numerous and less clear about the differences in meaning to people with French L1. So we had stuff like he falls down the table instead of he's falling off the table, he's falling out of the stall. We had he falls on, he falls onto, into, add to, because it just don't really know what the difference between all these prepositions are exactly. For still with the native French with English L2 sequential bilinguals, we also had, interestingly, differences compared to the other group of sequential bilinguals in that they tended to use personal animate subjects, even not needed. So there was a picture with a road and an arrow going up to kind of say the road goes up the hill or anything. And we had people just, producing stuff like we are going hiking, even though there was absolutely no one on the picture. There were no humans, no cars, nothing. They also use descriptions of static scenes. It's a sunny day at the beach. And interestingly enough, a couple of times we had people voicing their difficulties of producing something with an animate person. So here the person said, oh, there is a road and an arrow pointing up, but no one is moving, so I don't know. And again, interestingly, this wasn't the case for the people with English native French L2. Simultaneous bilinguals, we could find some of the same structures used as the sequential bilinguals. So passive structures were here. There is, static structures are here. Impersonal animate subjects were here, and descriptive sentences are here. Sorry, here it shouldn't be this. Okay. So you had someone is moving up the sponge, or the cake is being moved, and there is a picture of the sea. Okay. So to summarize experiment 1 in a nutshell, we had more grammatical correct sentences and expected. So describing the picture appropriately, not just saying, oh, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say here. So we had more of these with animates than inanimates. We saw that there was a proficiency influence for French native going into English L2, which we find here as an interaction here. Okay. For our simultaneous bilinguals, again, same as before, we had more grammatical unexpected sentences with animates and inanimates. So same as the sequential, but unlike the sequential, we had no language effect here at all. Okay. Experiment 2, what we were looking at here was specifically looking at manner and path here. So we were targeting this very strictly, and the procedure and the participants were similar to experiment 1. Okay. The pictures were different because we had to look at manner and path. So we used different verbs on this time. So they could have been jumping, climbing up, etc. So just to show you an example of the pictures that we ended up producing, you have a man running on the beach, un homme court, sur la plage, optional, you can use it, you can't. The boy is coming out of the house, le garçon sort de la maison, and we were looking at these, and we had 26 pictures for path, 26 pictures for manner, and we had different verbs each time. So we would have had to go down, to go up, to enter, to come out. Here you'd have running, jumping, climbing up. And so we were very careful with that. So after looking at the results, and again, taking into account only what was grammatically correct and what was describing the picture accurately. Oh, sorry, folks, I'm kind of sharing the wrong here. That makes sense. Apologies, folks. Here it is. There we go. Okay. There. So after looking at the results, what we saw for our bilinguals is we had an effect of verb type. So there were more correct answers produced with path than they were with manner in English and in French as well. Okay, so path was more grammatically accurate and expected than manner. What we saw as well that was very interesting is there was an interaction between the language of production and the verb type. So it means here that it was they were more correct and expected sentences produced in English than they were in French, okay, for path. So for my simultaneous bilinguals, what we found was that we had more path verbs produced in French than in English, less manner in French than in English, but overall, it wasn't a significant difference in terms of what they did. So to kind of have a look at what they did, that in terms of errors or qualitative analysis, if we look at our sequential bilinguals with French as an L2, what they did is they tended to use L1 patterns in their L2, but that weren't working. So, il marche sur les escaliers, he walks on the stairs or up the stairs. Instead of saying he's walking up the stairs, he's walking down the stairs. In this instance, we had someone going down the stairs, okay? Then what they did as well, they used path verbs with a construction that wasn't allowing it. So here we had a picture of a man jumping over a wall, and what the sequential bilingual said, il traverse le mur, or is crossing the wall, which is impossible unless you're a ghost, really, instead of saying he's jumping over the wall. So using cross instead of jump in this instance. When we looked at our sequential bilinguals, again with French L2, so still the same, what they tended to do is they tended to use transitive constructions even if it wasn't correct. So par, instead of partir de, to leave from or leave off, we'd have le garçon part l'église. So the boy leaves the church, or the boy is even coming out of the church, which is grammatically incorrect. They tended to overgeneralize the transitive construction to manner verbs as well. So same with grimpe. Grimpe works with two, il grimpe à l'arbre. But here what they did is said, il grimpe l'arbre, is climbing the tree, is climbing up the tree, which climb the tree is fine in English, doesn't work in French for grimper. For our sequential bilinguals with English L2, so the other group of sequential bilinguals, what we noticed is they tended to resort to Latin adverbs. So when they didn't know how to say something with a preposition, they saved themselves the hassle and they used a Latin adverb instead. So they could have is rotating, is circumventing, he is circulating. So you had a lot of these used instead of using to go up, to go around, etc. As before, they had a lot of problems with syntactic frames and the preposition. So a man is coming around the bakery instead of coming out of, going out of a church. We had crouching over the land instead of on, onto, gliding under a fence. Same, we had a lot of mix match between verbs and prepositions. Still with the same group, here just to show you how they found it really hard to distinguish between syntactic frames and verb, you had a man or a child, whatever you wanted to say, falling into a hole. So this became in a hole, on the floor, off in the hole. We had off into the hole as well. So we had a lot of them. And it was a clear indication they didn't know what they were saying in English. But bear in mind that at the time we'd asked them as well to translate what they were producing into the other language, to compare what they wanted to say to what they were actually producing. And all of these were used for the same French, il tombe dans le trou, as in into the hole. Which leads us to this statement that they didn't make the difference between an activity and a boundary crossing event. So for them, falling in and falling into was the same production. They couldn't see the difference between in, into, on, onto, etc., which again is quite common according to the literature. For simultaneous bilinguals, they tended to resort to using non-specific verbs when they weren't sure. go, get. They also used Latinate verbs that were quite unusual. So rotating his head instead of turning his head around or something along those lines. Used the transitive construction as well. And also had sometimes issues with in, into, on to, and similar enough to the sequential bilinguals, but not enough to make it significantly different. Sorry. So just to summarize everything here in a nutshell for you, we had for sequential bilinguals with English L2, they produced a higher proportion of correct sentences with manner verb. Sequential bilinguals with French L2 produced a higher proportion of correct sentences with path verb. Okay. We didn't observe incremental learning, and we didn't see any statistically difference between translators and advanced or upper intermediate learners. Okay. For our simultaneous bilinguals, here we saw that they did produce a bit more manner and a bit more path in one of the language, but that wasn't significantly different between the two. So the language of production did not influence in the end the accuracy of the sentence, neither did the verb type. Okay. However, what we did see, as I showed you earlier, is that when they were speaking in French, they tended to use a bit more path, and when they were speaking in English, they tended to use a bit more manner. Sorry, I just take it. So if we were to compare the qualitative analysis for sequential bilinguals, what we tend to note is if we have sequential bilinguals with French as an L1 but English as an L2, they tend to use a much wider variety of verbs to describe the motion events. So it can go from go, climb, rotate. It can be quite inventive and creative actually when you look at them. They had massive issues with prepositions where they don't really understand how the syntactic frame changes the meaning of the verb being used or what happens, and they had difficulties with boundary crossing events as well. For the other group, so the group with English as an L1 and French as an L2, they had problems using manner verbs in French. So for jump, grimper, they weren't sure if they were transitive and transitive constructions, so they went for transitive each time. They tended to use manner verbs when the others would have used path, and as I said, transitive constructions, or in some instances, what very interesting is they used some reflexive when there was no need to use reflexive either. So they were a bit lost in that. Oh, sorry. So what I was going to say here is that you have some indication that the L1 is influencing what they're saying, okay? But also that the difficulties with the L2 stops them from acquiring whatever they should be acquiring properly. So here, prepositions and the different meanings, and here manner verbs in French, which tend not to be used very often in regular language. So it's no wonder that it's a bit more difficult to acquire than if you're learning French as an L2. But what our results clearly show is that for the simultaneous bilingual, they were well able to speak in both their languages, and that the lexicons were activated, both lexicons were activated when they were producing their sentences, because you could see influence from both in what they were saying. So just a summary of what I've just said to you, that manner verbs are not very frequent in French, so our L2 learners might need more exposure to those to acquire them because it's not very obvious. For people who are adding English as a second language, prepositions are extremely opaque. It's not really obvious what each means or how it's distinguishable between different scenarios. Again, exposure to that with more explicit instructions on it and more explicit understanding of the meaning is clearly required. And then what we've noticed as well is that when it came from the pictures, it was much harder for them to say what they wanted to say. If they were just translating from one bit to another, when they were translating from English to French or whatever, it was a bit easier. So to have pictures like this was a very good good way of getting them to do things that they're not used to it. There is natural data out there, like the CLAPI database, that could be used to design more learning tasks for these language learners. And what's quite interesting is a recent study. So the one published in 2021 is actually taken some of the work that I've presented to you and looked at how we can teach language learners to acquire these forms. And what they've found is that if you combine explicit instruction about something plus form meaning processing, so form meaning processing means that you're making it hard for them to derive the meaning from the context. So say if you say je suis allé au supermarché, or I went to the supermarket, you wouldn't put yesterday in the sentence to make it harder for them to distinguish the past from the present from the future. So that's form meaning processing, making them do the work as much as possible as on the meaning. And then if you use affective structures input activities, so i.e. things that they come up with themselves, so if you follow that pattern, then you have successful acquisition. So so that was it for me. So that's good news. It means that it's hard, but you can get there. And especially for learners, there are ways of getting around to doing it. So I think I'm done for now. So I'm going to stop sharing this up. And I think, Lara, you're back on.
Thank you, Sarah, and I hope you can hear me. I think there were some problems to start with. We have some 10 minutes or so for questions. So if you want to write your questions, or even if you want to come in and unmute your microphones, if anybody wants to ask a question. I have a question, actually, Sarah.
Good.
What I wanted to ask you, perhaps you said that and I missed it. So the participants in the trials, did they write in their first language and then translated what they?
Good question, and I didn't mention it totally. They didn't write, they spoke. So I recorded the speaking. I asked them to speak in the other language. So for the sequentials, it would have been the L2 first. And when they were finished with all the L2, we went through the thing again, and I asked them to put their English or their French into the other language to get what they wanted to mean. For the simultaneous bilinguals, it was a tiny bit different because they did each task in each language at different times. So they would have started one with English and then French, and then the other experiment would have been French first and then English reversed. And with, I think it was 2 to 3 weeks in between to stop interference from each language to come in, if that makes sense, to try and control as much as we could.
Yeah, okay. And I was just wondering, did you find problems going from specific verbs in English, like to fly, for example, or to fly to a place, when you go into languages like Italian, for example, probably French as well,
yeah,
that becomes to go.
Yes,
and vice
yeah.
versa. So
Correct.
From specific to generic verbs and from, generic to specific. Were there problems like that?
They were and they weren't. I know it sounds like a weird answer, but the reason being is that you have language learners who want to achieve. They don't like failing. So they'd rather give you something very broad that is kind of correct instead of making a mistake. So instead of saying something like the man is running down the hill, he's running. And that way there's no mistakes. Okay. It's not so that's why it was very important for us when we looked at the result to look not only at the grammar, but also at matching the picture, because then you had someone as well. I remember there was a picture of a man kneeling down, and oh, I remember I had a simultaneous bilingual saying, oh, I forget what it is in French, speaking English for some reason, and then saying, oh, il danse, there we go, he's dancing, does the job, you know. So so it was quite important to have a look at both what was correct in terms of syntax, but also what was correct in terms of matching what we wanted, you know. Yeah,
Describe, yes.
yeah, it was interesting.
Interesting.
Mm.
We have actually Valerie here, says thank you, and she's asking, on what grounds did you set translators apart from the other subjects in the study?
Yes, so our translators had all completed a PG or postgraduate course in translation, and all of them had experience in translation. So I don't, actually, I have the mean data here because I was aware of time, so I didn't have time to just mention absolutely everything. But for our translators, bear with me, I will find it for you. Yeah, they had some at 2 years experience up to 11 years, and the mean was 6 years average of experience in translation. Now, the thing is, I think what's important to bear in mind for these is that in Europe anyways, and all the translators I tested were European, you work into your native language. So, you know, you don't work, it's becoming more common now, I guess, but at the time you only ever worked into your native language. So even though they might know what it means in English, you know, they'll go into their language rather than go into their L2 when they're working. So presume that could have been one of the reasons why there were no differences between the two levels of proficiency. Or it could be that two proficiency levels were very, very similar. So because your translators tend to be C1, C2 as well, and match the proficiency level of the advanced sequential bilinguals. So that's for further study, I guess. That makes sense.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? No. Okay. Well, then in that case, I want to thank Sarah and John. Would you like to say something?
Absolutely, yes.
Did you want to
Thank you
make an
very much
announcement?
indeed. Yes, thank you very much indeed, Laura, and thank you to Sarah as well. And just to thank you all for coming, and to say that our next CAM seminar is, I'm just looking at my diary here, is on Thursday, the 25th of November at 4 p.m. And that will be presented by my colleague, Katie Nielinchik from the Department of Irish. So we look forward to seeing as many of you as possible then. And thank you all for coming today. Thanks to Laura for chairing, and to Sarah for speaking, and to Matthew for technical support, and of course to Dan in the Moore Institute for hosting all of these events. So until the next time that we meet, thank you all for coming, and goodbye.